The marble halls of Boston's Suffolk County Courthouse echoed with the click of heels and the murmur of urgent conversations as Sarah Chen made her way through the morning crowd. Her navy Armani suit, once perfectly tailored, now hung slightly loose on her frame, but her stride remained purposeful, determined. At 34, she'd earned her reputation as one of the city's most formidable medical malpractice attorneys. Today, that reputation would be put to the ultimate test. The familiar wave of fatigue washed over her as she approached the fourth-floor women's restroom. 3 days post-chemotherapy, her body still fought against the poison meant to save her life. Sarah steadied herself against the cool marble counter, studying her reflection in the mirror. The silk headscarf midnight blue with subtle silver threads was artfully arranged to cover her bare scalp, a stark reminder of her ongoing battle with stage 3 lymphoma. But it was her eyes that commanded attention, fierce, intelligent, and utterly undefeated. 2 minutes, she whispered to herself, removing a small bottle of anti-nausea medication from her briefcase. The pills were bitter, but they were better than the alternative. She'd learned that lesson the hard way during her last court appearance, when she'd nearly collapsed during cross-examination. Today, she couldn't afford any weaknesses. Maria Gonzalez's future depended on it. Sarah pulled out a well-worn case file, its edges soft from countless reviews. The photographs inside still had the power to make her breath catch Maria's husband, Antonio, once a vibrant construction foreman, now permanently confined to a wheelchair. The MRI scan showing the tumor that should have been diagnosed months earlier. The damning timeline of ignored symptoms and dismissed complaints. A textbook case of medical negligence that had destroyed a family's life. The door swung open and Jessica Park, Sarah's junior associate, burst in. "They're ready for us," she said, then paused, concern flickering across her face. "Are you sure you're up for this?" Judge Harrison's reputation is exactly why we need to win this case, Sarah finished, straightening her spine. The movement sent a spike of pain through her shoulders, but her voice remained steady. Some judges need to be reminded that justice doesn't care about appearances. She gathered her materials, each motion precise and practiced. The weight of her briefcase seemed to increase with every step toward courtroom 7, but so did her resolve. Through the frosted glass, she could already see the packed gallery, other attorneys, law students and journalists, all eager to witness what promised to be a landmark case. Sarah took one final deep breath, feeling the familiar pre-trial adrenaline surge through her veins, temporarily masking her fatigue. Her oncologist had warned her about pushing too hard, about the risks of stress on her compromised immune system. But some battles were worth any price. She pushed open the heavy wooden doors, ready to fight not just for Maria Gonzalez, but for everyone who'd ever been dismissed, underestimated, or denied justice because they didn't fit someone else's image of what strength should look like. Judge William Harrison's entrance silenced the courtroom with the traditional all-rise as Sarah stood. She felt his gaze sweep over her, lingering on her headscarf with undisguised disdain. The corner of his mouth twitched upward in what could only be described as a smirk. "Counselor Chen," he drawled, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed courtroom. "I see you've chosen to make quite a fashion statement in my courtroom today." A few nervous titters emerged from the gallery, quickly stifled. Sarah's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her legal pad. "Your Honor, I am prepared to proceed with opening statements." "Are you?" Judge Harrison leaned forward, his steel gray eyes glinting. "You look rather indisposed. I wouldn't want your condition to interrupt these proceedings. Perhaps someone more robust should take over." The gallery fell dead silent. Sarah felt Jessica, her associate, stiffen beside her. In the front row, Maria Gonzalez clutched her husband's wheelchair handle, knuckles white with tension. "I assure you, Your Honor," Sarah replied, her voice steady despite the rage building in her chest, "my appearance has no bearing on my ability to represent my client effectively." Judge Harrison's laugh was sharp, cutting. "Well, we'll see about that, won't we? Though I must say, your choice of headwear reminds me more of a summer fashion show than a federal courthouse," he gestured dismissively. "Proceed if you must." Sarah stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Each step was measured, deliberate. She could feel the eyes of every person in the courtroom, the law students in the back row. Their faces shocked the court reporter, her fingers frozen over her stenotype, the defense counsel. Looking increasingly uncomfortable, "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice clear and unwavering. "This case is about more than medical negligence. It's about dignity, about being seen, about being heard." Her eyes met each juror's in turn. 3 years ago, Antonio Gonzalez walked into St. Mary's Hospital with persistent headaches and dizziness. He walked in on his own 2 feet. Today he cannot walk at all. She gestured to where Antonio sat in his wheelchair, his once powerful frame now diminished. "The defense will tell you that his symptoms were vague, that they followed standard protocol, that sometimes tragic things just happen. But what they won't tell you is how Dr. Peterson dismissed Mr. Gonzalez's concerns because he was a construction worker who spoke broken English. They won't tell you how 3 different nurses noted their concerns about his symptoms, only to be overruled." Judge Harrison cleared his throat loudly. "Ms. Chen, we're not here for a dramatic performance." "No, Your Honor," Sarah responded, turning to face him directly. "We're here for justice. And justice doesn't care what someone looks like, what they wear, or what battles they're fighting. Justice cares about truth." A murmur of approval rippled through the courtroom. Sarah caught a glimpse of Maria Gonzalez wiping tears from her eyes, while her teenage son sat beside her, jaw clenched in barely contained emotion. "The evidence will show," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger, "that Dr. Peterson's negligence wasn't just a mistake, it was a pattern. A pattern of dismissing patients who didn't fit his preconceptions of what a real patient should look like or sound like." She paused, letting her words sink in. By the time Mr. Gonzalez's brain tumor was finally discovered, it had grown to the size of a golf ball. The damage was irreversible. Judge Harrison's face had grown red, but Sarah pressed on, her own recent MRI results flashing through her mind. She knew too well how it felt to have medical concerns dismissed, to be treated as less than human. But unlike Antonio, she'd had the knowledge and resources to fight back. "Your Honor, she concluded, "we are prepared to present evidence that will leave no doubt about the devastating consequences of this negligence. And we trust that this court will ensure that justice is served regardless of appearances." 3 months earlier, Sarah sat in the sterile oncology ward of Massachusetts General Hospital, her laptop balanced precariously on the hospital tray as clear liquid dripped steadily through her IV. The harsh fluorescent lights made the medical charts on her screen blur, but she forced herself to focus. Each page of Antonio Gonzalez's medical records told a story of systematic neglect that hit too close to home. Ms. Chen, Nurse Rodriguez paused while checking her vitals. "Maybe you should rest during treatment. The chemo is strongest in the first hour." Sarah managed a weak smile but didn't look up from her screen. "I'll rest when we win this case." She highlighted another inconsistency in the hospital's documentation, adding it to her growing timeline of negligence. The nausea was building, but she'd learned to work through it. Time was a luxury her client couldn't afford. Her mind drifted to the day she'd first interviewed Maria Gonzalez. It was just after Sarah's diagnosis, when her own world was spinning off its axis. Maria had sat across from her desk, clutching a stack of medical bills. "They told us it was just stress," Maria had said, her voice breaking. "Antonio worked construction for 20 years. He never complained about headaches before. But Dr. Peterson, he just looked at Antonio's work clothes, heard his accent, and decided he was looking for workers' comp." Sarah had touched her own neck then, feeling the small lump that would soon change everything. She knew about doctors who dismissed patients' concerns. But unlike Antonio, she'd had the medical knowledge to advocate for herself, to demand the tests that saved her life. Back in her office after chemo, Sarah had developed a system. The morning hours, when her energy was highest, were for witness interviews. She'd spoken with 3 nurses who'd noted concerns about Antonio's symptoms, each one overruled by Dr. Peterson. Their testimonies painted a picture of institutional bias that made her blood boil. "Dr. Peterson has a pattern," Nurse Jameson had confided, glancing nervously around the coffee shop where they met. "If you're not white-collar, English-speaking, and well-insured, he assumes you're exaggerating. I've seen it happen too many times." Sarah had recorded every detail, fighting through the brain fog that chemotherapy left behind. Each testimony was a piece of the puzzle, building towards something bigger than one man's tragedy. The breakthrough came during a particularly rough evening. Sarah had been reviewing medical journals, searching for precedent, when a wave of nausea sent her running to the bathroom. As she sat on the cold tile floor, her tablet slipped from her hands, landing on an article about algorithmic bias in medical diagnostics. Through her fever-bright eyes, she saw the connection she'd been missing. Dr. Peterson hadn't just dismissed Antonio's symptoms, he'd failed to enter them into the hospital's diagnostic algorithm. The system was designed to flag concerning combinations of symptoms, but it could only work with the data it was given. By minimizing Antonio's complaints, the doctor had effectively silenced the very tools meant to prevent such catastrophic oversights. Sarah worked through the night, her desk cluttered with anti-nausea medications and legal precedents. She built a case that went beyond individual negligence, attacking the systemic biases that allowed such discrimination to flourish. The hospital's own data revealed a pattern: patients from certain zip codes, those with limited English proficiency, had their symptoms consistently downgraded. "You're building a class action," Jessica realized, watching Sarah pin another set of statistics to her office wall. "No," Sarah replied, her voice hoarse but determined. "We're building a revolution." She traced the connection between 3 similar cases in other hospitals. "The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as some people want it to work. We're going to prove that." The week before the trial, Sarah's oncologist had warned her about pushing too hard. Her white blood cell count was dangerously low, making her vulnerable to infection. But as she organized her evidence into a compelling narrative, she felt stronger than she had in months. Each document was a weapon in her arsenal, each testimony a brick in the wall of justice she was building. On the eve of the trial, Sarah stood in her home office, surrounded by the fruits of her labor. The case files were color-coded, cross-referenced, and backed up in triplicate. Her opening statement had been rehearsed until she could deliver it in her sleep. She'd even prepared multiple contingencies for Judge Harrison's expected hostility. Looking at her reflection in the window, Sarah adjusted her headscarf navy blue to match her power suit. Tomorrow, she would step into that courtroom not just as a lawyer, but as a warrior for everyone who'd ever been dismissed, diminished, or denied care because they didn't fit someone's idea of what a proper patient should be. Her phone buzzed with a text from Maria, "Keeping you in our prayers, Ms. Chen." Sarah touched the screen gently. "Justice is coming," she whispered, both a promise and a prayer. The nausea was building again, but so was her resolve. Tomorrow she would show Judge Harrison and the world that true legal brilliance had nothing to do with appearance and everything to do with perseverance. The courtroom hummed with tension as Dr. Peterson took the stand, his silver hair perfectly coiffed, his bearing confident. Sarah observed him carefully, noting the way he adjusted his Italian silk tie, a man accustomed to authority and deference. Behind her, she could hear Antonio Gonzalez's wheelchair creak as he shifted position. "Dr. Peterson," Sarah began, her voice steady despite the waves of fatigue washing over her. "Could you explain your initial assessment of Mr. Gonzalez's symptoms?" "Of course," he replied, his tone patronizing. "Mr. Gonzalez presented with generalized headaches. Given his occupation in construction, the most likely cause was simple tension or possibly an attempt to—" "Objection, Your Honor," Sarah interrupted. "The witness is speculating about the patient's motives." But Judge Harrison sighed theatrically. "Ms. Chen, perhaps if you'd let the doctor finish his thought. Unless you're finding it difficult to follow his explanation." Sarah felt the courtroom's eyes on her headscarf. "I'm following perfectly, Your Honor. I'm simply ensuring the testimony stays within proper bounds." She turned back to Dr. Peterson, producing a document from her evidence folder. "Doctor, I'm showing you Exhibit 27, the triage nurse's initial notes. Could you read the highlighted portion?" Dr. Peterson squinted at the paper. "Patient reports severe headaches, increasing in frequency over past month, accompanied by dizziness and visual disturbances." And yet Sarah continued, her steps measured as she approached the witness stand. "Your own notes from that same visit describe, and I quote, minor headache complaints. Can you explain the discrepancy?" "Well, in my professional judgment." "Your professional judgment," Sarah's voice took on a razor's edge. "Like your judgment 3 months earlier with Mrs. Eleanor Whitney, a corporate executive who presented with similar symptoms." "Objection," the defense counsel jumped to his feet. "Relevance." Sarah turned to Judge Harrison, who was already opening his mouth to sustain the objection. "Your Honor, I'm establishing a pattern of differential treatment based on socioeconomic status." The Whitney case is directly relevant to showing bias in diagnostic procedures. Judge Harrison's face reddened. Ms. Chen, this court won't be lectured on. If I may, Sarah pressed on, producing another document. The Supreme Court's ruling in Matthews v. Cedars-Sinai established that evidence of discriminatory treatment patterns is admissible when demonstrating systemic medical negligence. I've prepared copies for the court. The judge's clerk handed him the brief. Sarah used his moment of distraction to steal a sip of water, willing her churning stomach to settle. She couldn't afford to show weakness now. In the Whitney case, Sarah continued once the judge grudgingly allowed her line of questioning. You ordered an MRI within hours of her first complaint. Yet with Mr. Gonzalez you waited 6 months, despite increasingly severe symptoms. Why? Dr. Peterson shifted uncomfortably. Each case is unique. Indeed, they are. Sarah interrupted, projecting a spreadsheet onto the courtroom screen. This data, pulled from the hospital's own records, shows that patients from certain zip codes wait an average of 4.2 times longer for advanced diagnostic tests. Would it surprise you to learn that these zip codes correlate directly with lower income, predominantly immigrant neighborhoods? The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Judge Harrison banged his gavel. Ms. Chen, I'm warning you. I'm merely establishing the foundation, Your Honor, Sarah replied, her voice somehow both respectful and unyielding. In Ramirez v. Metropolitan Hospital, the Ninth Circuit held that statistical evidence of discriminatory medical treatment constitutes. I'm familiar with the case law, counselor, the judge snapped. Then you'll recall, Sarah pressed, fighting to keep her voice steady as another wave of nausea hit, that the court specifically addressed the issue of implicit bias in medical decision-making. She turned back to Dr. Peterson, who was now visibly sweating. Doctor, could you explain why you didn't enter Mr. Gonzalez's complete symptom profile into the hospital's diagnostic algorithm? I used my clinical judgment. Your clinical judgment, Sarah nodded, picking up another exhibit. Like you used your clinical judgment with these other patients. She handed him a stack of files. Maria Torres, 2019. Jose Rodriguez, 2020. Ahmed Patel, 2021. All presenting with neurological symptoms. All initially dismissed. All eventually diagnosed with serious conditions after months of delay. The defense counsel leapt up again. Your Honor, this is beyond the scope. No, Sarah's voice rang out clear and firm. This is exactly the scope. This case isn't just about one tragic mistake. It's about a system that values some lives more than others. A system that decided my client's life was worth less because of his accent, his occupation, his zip code. Judge Harrison's face had turned an alarming shade of purple. Ms. Chen, you will confine yourself to the facts of this specific case. These are the facts. Your Honor. Sarah held up the statistical analysis. The numbers tell the story. The hospital's own data proves that patients like Mr. Gonzalez systematically receive lower standards of care. And today we're going to prove that this discrimination cost my client everything. She turned back to Dr. Peterson, who seemed to have aged years in the past few minutes. Now, Doctor, let's discuss exactly what happened when the nurses first raised concerns about Mr. Gonzalez's symptoms. The afternoon session began with Sarah's hands trembling slightly as she approached the evidence table. Her vision blurred momentarily. The morning's chemotherapy was catching up with her, but she gripped the edge of the table and steadied herself. This was the moment everything hinged on. Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit 42, she said, her voice unwavering despite her physical distress. These are Dr. Peterson's private notes, obtained during discovery, showing a systematic pattern of the room suddenly tilted sideways, and Sarah caught herself against the podium. Judge Harrison leaned forward, his expression shifting from annoyance to concern. Ms. Chen, do you need a recess? No, Your Honor. Sarah straightened, though her complexion had gone ashen. The court has already heard enough delays. I'll proceed. She gestured to Jessica, who dimmed the lights and activated the projector. On the screen appeared a series of handwritten notes, Dr. Peterson's private patient commentary spanning 5 years. Sarah began highlighting entries, her laser pointer steady despite her trembling hand. January 15th, 2019, another workers' comp case. These people need to learn. Sarah's voice caught as a wave of nausea hit her. She swallowed hard and continued. Need to learn that headaches don't equal paydays. The jury leaned forward, riveted. Sarah moved to the next entry. But March 3rd, 2020 patient insists on translator. If they can't communicate, how can they possibly? Sarah stumbled, catching herself against the exhibit table. The room spun violently. Counselor Judge Harrison's voice held an unfamiliar note of genuine concern. I'm ordering a recess. Your Honor, please. Sarah's voice was barely above a whisper now. There's one more entry. The day Mr. Gonzalez first came in. She fumbled with the remote, advancing to the final slide. The text was damning another construction worker with mysterious symptoms. Their kind always exaggerates. Sister had the same attitude when she... Sarah's legs buckled. The remote clattered to the floor as she gripped the podium, knuckles white. But her voice remained clear. The entry ends there, Your Honor. But hospital records show that Dr. Peterson's sister, Maria Peterson Gonzalez, died of an undiagnosed brain tumor in 1992. She was a housekeeper. Her symptoms were dismissed for months. A gasp rippled through the courtroom. Judge Harrison had gone completely still, his face ashen. Sarah saw recognition flash in his eyes. He'd presided over that case. He'd ruled in the hospital's favor. The systemic bias we've demonstrated, Sarah continued, her voice growing fainter, doesn't just destroy lives. It perpetuates itself. Even those who've experienced its cruelty sometimes become its instruments. The room was spinning faster now. Sarah felt her grip on the podium loosening. Through darkening vision, she saw Judge Harrison half rising from his seat, genuine alarm replacing his usual disdain. This court, Sarah's voice was barely audible now, cannot allow. Another family. She never finished the sentence. Her knees buckled and she crumpled to the floor. The courtroom erupted in chaos. As consciousness faded, Sarah heard Judge Harrison's voice cutting through the commotion. Order. Someone get medical help immediately. Then, more quietly, with a catch in his voice she'd never heard before, I was wrong. God help me. I was wrong. When Sarah's eyes fluttered open minutes later, she found herself on a courtroom bench, an EMT checking her vital signs. Judge Harrison stood nearby, his judicial demeanor cracked wide open, revealing something raw and human underneath. Mess. Chen, he said softly, I owe you an apology. More than that, I owe this court, and justice itself, an apology. He turned to face the gallery, his voice gaining strength. This trial will resume tomorrow. And when it does, we will ensure that every piece of evidence is heard fairly and fully. Every single piece. Sarah managed a weak smile as Jessica helped her sit up. In the judge's eyes, she saw something she recognized, the same fire that had driven her through months of treatment and preparation. The fire of someone who'd finally understood that justice wasn't just about laws on paper, but about recognizing the humanity in every person who stepped into a courtroom. Sarah stood before the jury for her closing argument, her strength renewed after a day's rest. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, with observers standing along the walls. Judge Harrison sat attentively, the previous mockery in his eyes replaced by something that looked remarkably like respect. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Sarah began, her voice clear and strong. When this trial began, I told you it was about more than one man's tragedy. Today, I stand before you knowing that statement was both true and incomplete. She moved away from the podium, standing directly before the jury box. This case has revealed something profound about our healthcare system, about who gets heard, who gets held, who gets helped, and who gets left behind. Mr. Gonzalez wasn't just failed by one doctor. He was failed by a system that saw his work clothes instead of his humanity, his accent instead of his pain. Sarah gestured to where Antonio sat in his wheelchair, Maria's hand on his shoulder. Look at this family. 3 years ago, Antonio Gonzalez could carry his son on his shoulders. He could work 12-hour days building the very structures we all take for granted. Now, he needs help to feed himself, all because a doctor decided that some lives matter less than others. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably in his seat as Sarah continued. We've shown you the evidence not just of one mistake, but of a pattern. A pattern that destroys lives, that tears families apart, that makes a mockery of the oath to first do no harm. She turned to face Dr. Peterson. And yes, we've seen how this pattern perpetuates itself, how even those who've experienced its cruelty can become its instruments. But today, in this courtroom, we have the power to break that pattern. Judge Harrison leaned forward, clearing his throat. "If I may," he interrupted, his voice carrying unusual emotion. "I feel compelled to address the court." He removed his glasses, looking directly at the jury. "Throughout this trial, I have witnessed not only excellence in legal advocacy, but also a profound lesson in the true meaning of justice. Ms. Chen has shown remarkable courage, not just in her personal battle, but in forcing us all to confront our own biases." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Sarah stood perfectly still, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Continue," Counselor, the judge said softly. Sarah took a deep breath. "The defense would have you believe that medicine is imperfect, that sometimes tragic things just happen. But that's not what happened here. What happened to Antonio Gonzalez was the result of choices made by people who had the power to help but chose not to listen, not to see, not to care." She walked to the evidence table, picking up the statistical analysis. "The numbers don't lie. The pattern is clear. But you have the power to say no more. Not in our community, not in our hospitals, not in our name." The jury's foreman wiped tears from her eyes as Sarah concluded, "I ask you to deliver justice, not just for Antonio Gonzalez, but for every patient who's ever been dismissed, diminished, or denied care because they didn't fit someone's idea of what a proper patient should look like. Let your verdict send a message that will echo through every hospital corridor. Every life has value. Every voice deserves to be heard. Every person deserves care." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. When they returned, the foreman's voice rang clear. "We find in favor of the plaintiff. The compensation awarded was the largest in the state's history for a medical malpractice case." As the courtroom erupted in celebration, Judge Harrison descended from the bench. He approached Sarah, who stood exhausted but triumphant. "Ms. Chen," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "you have taught this court a lesson we won't soon forget. Your advocacy has changed not just one case, but the very way we see justice itself." Sarah looked at Maria and Antonio embracing, their son wrapped in their arms. "Justice," she replied softly, "looks different on everyone, Your Honor. But it feels the same to us all. 6 months after the verdict." Sarah Chen stood at the podium of the Massachusetts Bar Association's annual conference, her dark hair beginning to grow back in soft curls. The audience before her included judges, attorneys, and law students, all eager to hear from the woman who had transformed medical malpractice law in the state. The Gonzalez case wasn't just about one family's tragedy, she began, her voice stronger than ever. It was about acknowledging that justice wears many faces, speaks with many voices, and sometimes needs a little help standing up in court. In the front row, Judge William Harrison nodded, a gesture that would have seemed impossible months ago. Since the trial, he had become an outspoken advocate for diversity in the legal profession, particularly regarding accommodations for attorneys with health challenges. The day after the verdict, Sarah continued, 3 law firms called to offer me partnerships. But what moved me most was the flood of emails from attorneys across the country, attorneys battling illness, disability, or discrimination who had been afraid to show their full selves in court. She paused, looking down at the letter in her hands. One wrote, "Watching you stand your ground, refusing to hide your struggle while fighting for justice, gave me the courage to return to practice after my MS diagnosis." The Gonzalez family had used part of their settlement to establish a foundation supporting equal access to healthcare in underserved communities. Antonio, though still in his wheelchair, had become a powerful speaker at medical schools, helping future doctors understand the human cost of bias. But the real change, Sarah said, has been in our courtrooms. She gestured to the newly installed accessibility features in legal chambers across the state, changes sparked by her case. We're finally recognizing that justice isn't served by hiding our challenges, but by confronting them openly. Judge Harrison took the podium next, his transformation evident in every word. Ms. Chen didn't just win a case, he declared. She held up a mirror to our profession and forced us to confront our prejudices. Today, I'm proud to announce that our circuit has unanimously adopted new guidelines ensuring accommodations for attorneys facing health challenges. The guidelines, known informally as the Chen Protocols, would ensure that no lawyer would have to choose between their health and their client's justice. Already, 3 other states had adopted similar measures. Sarah's own law firm, Chen Associates, had become a beacon for young attorneys from diverse backgrounds. Her hiring practices prioritized talent and determination over traditional metrics, and her mentorship program specifically supported lawyers managing chronic illnesses or disabilities. My oncologist told me recently that I'm in complete remission, Sarah shared, touching the small silver pendant at her neck, a gift from Maria Gonzalez. But the real recovery has been in our legal system. We're learning that strength comes in many forms, that courage doesn't always wear a power suit, and that justice is best served when we embrace our full humanity. As she concluded her speech, Sarah caught sight of a young law student in the back, her head wrapped in a bright scarf. Their eyes met in silent understanding. The torch was already being passed. That evening, at a small celebration in her office, Sarah found a note from Judge Harrison. "You taught an old judge that true justice requires not just knowledge of the law, but knowledge of the heart. Your courage has changed not just our profession, but all of us who witnessed it." On her office wall hung 2 photographs, one of the Gonzalez family, smiling at their son's college graduation, and another of her legal team, taken the day of the verdict. Between them was framed the first page of the Chen Protocols, its opening words capturing the spirit of everything she had fought for. Justice serves all who serve justice, regardless of their physical condition, appearance, or personal battles. The measure of an attorney lies not in their limitations, but in their determination to overcome them in pursuit of what is right.